I'm Dr. Mark Thompson. I'm a governing body fellow at Green Templeton College, standing in for a principal who's away in the States and would love to have been here. But just a few words of introduction about the relationship between Green Templeton College and the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. It was actually the 30th anniversary of this relationship last year, so it's quite long-standing. And it's a place where science and journalism have actually been discussed for unfortunately, quite a long time. And it's a place where these topics collide, collaborate, and provide the opportunity, a bit too often, to commiserate about the state of science and journalism. The Reuters Institute, in terms of its development, has focused quite strongly on this relationship, setting up the Oxford Climate Journalism Network, which seeks to provide journalists around the world with the science, the skill, and the support and camaraderie they need to present publicly informed debate on this crisis facing us today. The talk today is about refocusing attention on the climate crisis, which is disturbing as a title in itself, as if we didn't need to. Why do we need to refocus on that? But we'll hear more about why that will be. It's also quite fitting that we're in the Maths Institute, only a stone's throw away from the longest standing meteorological station in the UK, which has been charting our climate crisis for a couple of centuries now, and still records increasing rainfall, which we've had over the last week or so. I'd also like to briefly introduce our speakers. Friederike, or Freddie Otto, who used to be at Oxford, down the road at Imperial, now at the Grantham Institute for Climate Change. And I won't go through her very impressive CV, but just pick out a couple of things of note. One is the very aptly titled book, which is very, very well known, Angry Weather. A best-selling one, which you should buy. And the second is her development of the World Weather Attribution network and approach. And the whole area of climate change attribution has been quite central in her work, to the extent that she is one of the top 10 people globally, according to Nature, in this field. And Time have noted her as one of the 100 most influential climate scientists in the world. So you're in very good company. I'd also like to introduce Sanyu May, who will be joining us, and Diego Ortiz, who will be joining the debate as well. Sanyu May is a research fellow at Green Templeton College and is the lead for education for sustainable healthcare in the Medical Sciences Division. And there's issues here around climate. Planetary health is the field that she has developed most significantly. And the relationship between climate and our health is a growing and very important field. I'd also like to introduce Diego Ortiz, who's the Associate Director at the Oxford Climate Journalism Network at the Reuters Institute. A couple of things that are really impressive here to note are he's actually been at 6 UN climate conferences, so significant knowledge of the process there. Was also involved in the Panama Papers, which many of you will have no doubt read in the past, and has been an advisor on climate change communication for the Minister of Environment and Energy in Costa Rica. So you're in very good hands in terms of these issues. I'm very happy now to hand over to Mitai, who will set the context and lead the debate. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. And just by way of quick introductions, I'm Mitali Mukherjee. I'm currently acting director at the Reuters Institute of Journalism. Just as our name suggests, we work with journalists from across the world on issues that we think are of utmost importance in terms of the challenges the industry is facing. One of the things we did 2 years back was give birth to, literally, the idea of the Oxford Climate Journalism Network. What are we doing? We're talking to journalists across the world And when I say across the world, I would like to underline that word because we've now worked with journalists from 106 countries about the need and importance of building climate into what they report. We're not talking to a climate reporter and we're not talking to a climate desk. We're talking to everyone in journalism about why climate is a lens they need to apply when they are reporting a story accurately. That's a little bit of context about what we do. I know it's a very big room and a more intimate audience, so I'll try and sort of modulate my audio to not sound bombastic, but fill the room. Before we start the discussion with Freddie, of whom you've heard some very warm and fitting words, I just want to take a second also, particularly because we are stepping into COP in a few days from now, to pause and pay tribute to and give thanks to and just remember Professor Salim Haq, who was, well, he was many things, but for us, he was part of the advisory board of the Oxford Climate Journalism Network. He worked with journalists, and that's 100 journalists every cohort, and did a session on loss and damages. Diego has done 6 COPs. I think Professor Haq did, I don't know how many. I think all. And he's the man really behind the idea of a loss and damages fund. I think it's quite fitting as well because for those of you who may not know, the word haq in Urdu means right. And I think no one could speak better to the rights of those who need it and deserve it when you talk about loss and damages. So having said that, let's move into the conversation. What we usually do is play a brief video just to give you some context of what we're talking about and what the general lay of the land is. And then, of course, it will be over to Freddie.
Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. This is The Briefing. In 2 weeks' time, representatives from 198 countries will gather in the UAE for COP28, the annual climate meeting. On the agenda, a global review of progress towards the Paris Agreement goals and new discussions around mitigation, adaptation and finance, including loss and damage talks, a critical issue for developing countries that bear the brunt of climate change. Thousands of journalists are expected to cover the summit, but critics say their coverage tends to focus too heavily on process over substance, lacks scientific expertise, overemphasizes conflict, and neglects perspectives of developing and marginalized communities. When we polled working journalists to ask if they thought the media was doing a good job, 57% said no, 36% said yes, and 7% were unsure. Today, we'll meet Dr Friederike Otto, a leading expert on climate attribution and a pioneering voice for persuasive and accessible climate change information, to ask what questions we should be posing at COP28 and how to win back attention for the defining issue of our time. We'll also hear expert contributions from Diego Arguedas-Ortiz, Associate Director of the Oxford Climate Journalism Network, and Dr Sanya Mayton, Green Templeton Research Fellow and Lead for Education for Sustainable Healthcare in the Medical Sciences Division at the University of Oxford. That's The Briefing. Let's begin.
So there you have it. Freddie, I'm not Nish Kumar, but I will try to keep this an engaging conversation. And for those who haven't seen this, I highly recommend an extremely engaging video that Freddie is a part of, where she's talking about the climate challenges, and so is Nish Kumar, just in slightly different languages, but both, I think, very, very important ones. Freddie, it would be good, I think, for people gathered here to first understand a little bit around and behind the birth of the organization that you co-founded. And I just want to put a place setter there, which is in a continent like the USA, for example, we are at current count going with 40 plus in terms of natural disasters, $1 billion in terms of the monetary impact of that. What are we talking about when we talk about extreme weather events?
Well, I think that is actually always a difficult question because there is a very simple definition of what an extreme weather event is from a scientific point of view. It's just rare. So it's sort of in the tails of the distribution. So in the 90th percentile or 10th percentile of the distribution. So just something that doesn't happen very often is what scientifically is an extreme weather event. But of course, what we usually talk about when we talk about extreme weather events are weather events that have led to severe impacts on people, on ecosystems. And these events don't have to be rare at all from a scientific point of view. And so also with World Weather Attribution, we are actually looking at events that cause extreme impacts in lots of them and severe impacts on people. That's the events we're looking at, whether they are rare from a scientific point of view or not.
I think it's important you make the point about rare, and I suppose that's what the big jolt has been in the last few years as we see it. So definitely more intense, more likely, more deadly. But the tricky one is the middle one, the more likely that these events have become. From when you started to where we're at now, Freddie, just to give people a sense of what you're dealing with, what's the increase look like?
So when we started to do World Weather Attribution, and when I started to do this kind of work, it's roughly 10 years ago. It's a bit over 10 years ago. So global mean temperatures were about 0.8 degrees then. Now we have about 1.2 degrees of global warming. So that's only that's a bit over a decade. But we have seen a huge increase in warming in that time. And that, of course, we always talk about global mean temperatures. So we always talk about the Paris goals of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. So it has brought us a lot closer to that. But of course, what that means on the ground is that extreme events, in particular heat waves, that used to be extreme events from a scientific point of view, rare events happening only once in a century or so, are now actually not rare events anymore at all. And so particularly this summer, we've seen that, but the last 2 years before that as well, the extreme heat we saw in the US, the extreme heat we saw in Southern Europe, extreme heat we saw in China, those were all events that would have been impossible to occur without human-induced climate change, which means they would have been so rare without climate change that you would expect them to happen, once in a billion years or so, which is the statistical equivalent of never. But now these events, so we've done studies on this, on the heat wave in Southern Europe is about a 1 in 10 year event today. The heat wave in China is about a 1 in 5 year event today. So that means, of course, not that it happens every 10 years, but it means that in any given year, at this climate we live in today, at 1.25 degrees of warming roughly, there is a 10% chance of such an extreme heat wave to happen. But as long as we burn fossil fuels, these chances are increasing very fast. And so it will be something that is actually a normal summer. And depending on when we stop burning fossil fuels, it might be that what we have experienced this summer in large parts of the Northern Hemisphere will actually be a cool summer.
And that's the most important part of the work that you do, the attribution, in essence, who specifically is responsible. When you started off, and I read about this, was it that easy to sort of explain this to a larger community, both the scientific community and the broader audience, if you will?
No, it wasn't, and I'm not sure it's easy now. I think it has definitely become easier because it's just something we have been talking about a lot, and also something you just can't avoid anymore. You can't walk out the door without experiencing extreme weather, more or less. To slightly paraphrase Nish Kumar, but
just minus the expletives.
Yeah. But when we started, the first event we have ever tried to attribute was for World Weather Attribution. So in this rapid way where we do a scientific study, but not on the normal scientific timescales, which are usually, you work for 6 months or so on a study, and then you send it out for peer review to a scientific journal, and then you wait for a year or a year and a half, and then 2 years after the event has occurred, you have the result of the role of climate change. So that's sort of how the timescales of academic publishing work. And of course, everyone has completely forgotten about the event by then. And so the reason for setting up World Weather Attribution was that this way of working in the scientific community meant that when extreme weather events happened, and of course also 10 years ago, people always asked the question when an extreme event happened, was this climate change? Then lots of people gave answers, but the scientific community was basically silent. And so all the people who gave answers had no scientific evidence for whatever they were saying, but just had opinions and political ideas. And so the reason for us for founding World Weather Attribution was that we wanted to bring in scientific evidence into this conversation that was happening anyway. And so that was why we set up World Weather Attribution and said, okay, we can actually do these studies fast. We can't, of course, peer review them fast, but we can do them fast. And that was what we did. And the first study we ever did was on a heat wave in Paris in 2015. It was actually not just in Paris. We were in Paris at the time for a scientific conference, but the heat wave was in large parts of Western Europe. And we looked at different cities, Zurich and Madrid and Paris itself, and answered the question whether and to what extent human-induced climate change had made this event hotter and more likely. No one really covered the study at all, so we didn't get any journalists picking this up, but a lot of scientists noticed it and said, oh, you can't do this is too fast, and also saying, oh, and because we didn't, and of course at that time we thought, okay, we just calculate the numbers and sort of write a little fact sheet, but then lots of actually scientists were questioning out what exactly did you do, and then we actually ended up then afterwards writing up as a paper to explain what we did. And so this is still what we do. So every time we do a rapid study now, we also write up a paper that is in its essence a scientific paper, so that every step that we do is documented. It's absolutely transparent what we do. Everyone, all the data we use is freely available, so everyone can go away and redo what we do. Yeah. So, and then I think the next study we did was on Storm Desmond here in the UK, which was the first one where we actually reached some journalists and some media were covering our studies. And yeah, I think we've since then grown massively the media we reach with these studies. So and we could do so many more studies than we actually can do with the people we have. So there's a huge demand still for this kind of information.
Yeah. What's the point of friction that you still face when you do your work? Because it seems almost intuitive now at this point in time where we live that there is a clear correlation. Where is it that you still face friction when you talk about weather attribution?
So for some types of extreme events, we basically don't actually need to do a study if you want to know, is climate change playing a role? So we know that every heat wave that's happening now has been made more likely, more intense because of climate change. But of course, how much more likely and how much more intense is something that you can't say globally, so that depends on the local context. But that's not the case for other types of extreme events. So for heavy rainfall, we know on global average, because a warmer atmosphere can help more water vapor, and that needs to get out of the atmosphere. So we do see an increase in heavy rainfall globally, but locally, this can be counteracted by changes in the atmospheric circulation. So that means where weather systems develop, how they move, and these two effects, so the warming and therefore more water, and the changes in the atmospheric circulation, they can either go in the same direction, so you have more extreme rainfall because of the warming, but you also get more low pressure systems bringing in rainfall, so you have actually a much higher increase in heavy rainfall. So one study where we saw that very strikingly was last year, where we looked at flooding in Nigeria, where there was extremely heavy rainfall, and that was made about 80 times more likely because of climate change, which is not something you just expect from the warming, but it also means that we have the intertropical convergence zone actually moving or spending more time over that part of the world than it used to in its passage from north to south. And so bringing in so much more rain. But of course, these two effects can also work in the opposing directions, and that's something we've seen with a study we did over extreme flooding in Italy, in the Emilia-Romagna, where because of the warming, you see an increase, but there actually were fewer low pressure systems bringing in situations that are conducive to rainfall. So overall, we don't actually see a change because of climate change. And it's these kind of studies where that are interesting, that are scientifically interesting, but also where of course there is still there's some friction on because lots of people want that. There now is an expectation that if we do a study, we say it's climate change, and so if we don't fulfill that expectation, there are people who are really upset. And also there is still some scientific debate of have you done this right or not, and if you use different methods, would you get a different result? So there's still debate in the scientific community, and we are still the only group in the world who do this. So a lot of Met services around the world have talked about for years setting up operational attribution services, but no one's done it yet.
It's like the classic academic conundrum, right? You can't please anyone. It's an odd question to ask, but how do you pick? How do you pick an event you would like to go deeper with? And it would be great if you could share with the audience, because I was fascinated when I read that story about how you tracked the wildfires in Australia, and that it was clashing around Christmas time, and this was growing and growing and growing. How do you pick the event that you would like to follow through?
So we have actually now a very formalized process on how to do that. So we used to, when we started, it was just, okay, whatever caught our attention. But there we then very quickly realized we actually, what gets attention, especially in what gets attention in the media, is stuff that's happening in the US and stuff that's happening in Europe, but nothing really, or almost nothing happening anywhere else in the world. But of course, there are extreme events happening, and they have huge humanitarian impacts. So, and we have from the start partnered with the Red Cross Climate Center, and so we have now, and so we then started to focus on humanitarian impacts as basically our criteria to bring events to our attention, and we have now formalize this process. So we have for every type of extreme event, so for flooding, it's either, so one criteria is that 100 or more people have lost their lives, or 1 million or more people are affected, or more than 50% of the population are affected. So that would then trigger an event, bring it to our attention. Similar criteria for drought. Heat waves, difficult, quite different criteria. Maybe we can talk about that later. And so we have, so one of the members of our team is actually monitoring humanitarian appeals. The Red Cross ask for help and so on, so that we, and every Monday we have a meeting where we go through the events that have triggered in that week, and see, okay, so this Monday we had only 2 events, which is rare. So it was a heat wave in South America and a heat wave in the Caribbean. But usually it's sort of, this year it was usually every week it's between 5 to 10 events. And then we decide which to look at based on, well, for example, based on did all our criteria met, or just maybe one? Do we have people power available that we can actually do a study? And then also we are really trying really hard to increase our regional diversity, so when an event happens in a part of the world where we haven't done much or we haven't done anything, then we would give that priority. So that is how we pick the events. And we often get accused that we never do droughts in the US or Europe, but they don't have humanitarian impacts. Yeah. So at the moment we are quite okay with not really having them. But
let me pivot to a slightly larger aspect of this. Earlier this week I was in conversation with sort of organizations working around climate, where there was one representative from South Africa, and I think one of our OCGN alumna, Maria Monica, has written about that in her essay as well that we published recently. For a lot of the wider public, they feel like focusing on climate is distracting from core issues like unemployment and poverty and lack of infrastructure. What would you share as sort of experience and advice to journalists to help make a broader public understand that it's all the same? It's all feeding into each other. One is the function of the other.
So yeah, well, it sort of starts with our trigger, because those parts of the world where and they are in all parts of the world, but it's usually in where vulnerable communities live. Of course, we have many more events that are triggered because more people are affected by extreme weather, and it's usually people who have little education, who are unemployed and have therefore also very little economic means. Yeah. They are the ones who are the first to die in an extreme weather event. They are the ones who suffer the longest, if they haven't died, after an extreme weather event to recover. So it's, for example, even in a country like the US, which on average probably has is not very vulnerable, in the parts of Houston that have been destroyed by Hurricane Harvey in 2017, the rich people have rebuilt their houses and are fine. That's not a problem. But the poorer parts of the population who have lost their houses live still in temporary housing, have still not got their life back to their feet, and that's something we see across the world. So every time when people talk about adaptation, it's usually people think about building a dam or some other kind of fancy infrastructure, flood defense. But actually, the best thing to adapt to climate change is to increase education, to have better built houses, to have access to information for the whole population, to have access to healthcare, and have access also to other economic other sources of income than, for example, agriculture in drought-prone areas.
Yeah, it's a good segue also to ask you on, and this is where the work that you've done stands out amongst other organizations working on climate, which is that you've engaged quite deeply and actively with the journalistic community. I mean, in terms of resources, I think it's in any number of languages, Spanish, Japanese, Hindi, if you go to your website. And you've always been quite accessible to the journalistic community. Why do you think that's important?
It's sort of our raison d'être. So we founded World Weather Attribution because this conversation in the media, particularly in the media, about what the role of climate change is and in extreme weather events is happening anyway. And also, extreme weather events are something that focuses the attention of people on their environment in a way, and the media is writing about it. And so if we want, and that is what we did want, if we want to have this conversation happen on the basis of scientific evidence on what the role of climate change is, what the role of vulnerability is, what the role of exposure is, we need to engage with the people who write the stories and who tell the stories and who build the narratives around these extreme events. And these are, to a large degree, journalists. And so that is why we have, from early on, reached out to journalists that we knew, which were very few at the time, and have grown that network. And yeah, and we very regularly, well, I always come and give a seminar on your course, but we also do just background workshops for journalists, and every time we publish a study, we do a media briefing. And if it's a study about an extreme event in Rwanda and the Congo, then we have maybe 2 journalists show up. We still do a media briefing for them. If it's something that happens in the US, we have 200 journalists coming. But it's still, of course, when you have these small media briefings, that also allows to give more details and to build then relationships with journalists. And I think that it is just important that also, and I hope that, and also I try at the same time, trying the people in my team to give them media training, to encouraging them to talk to journalists, so that journalists have a broader network of scientists to speak to.
Yeah, it's a good point, I think, to share with the audience that yesterday the Reuters Institute published our own research that we do across 8 countries in terms of climate news and how audiences engage with that. Shout out to the lead author, Waqas Ijaz. I co-authored that, but I think so many important findings there, Freddie. For most people, they feel that anyone who can impact large and important verticals like business and policy and politics remain the media. But what was also interesting was that across some of these countries like India and Pakistan, for instance, people don't see the impact of climate change as right here, right now. It's something that they park a bit far. But what they do feel right here, right now is the impact of health. They all feel that climate is impacting their health and the health of their families. Is that something that you've started working more deeply around as well, just with the humanitarian focus?
Yes, although, and I said earlier when I talked about the trigger criteria, heat waves are really difficult. So we know that the deadliest extreme weather events are heat waves. Heat waves have, where we do have the data, so in London and southern UK, last year was an extreme heat wave. In 2 days, more than 2,000 people died because of the extreme heat. But these people don't fall dead on the street. They are often people that already have pre-existing medical conditions, or they are people who live in very poor housing and just die in their poorly insulated homes or in hospitals. And so we don't see them. The numbers will only be available, where they are available at all, month after the event. So it's not something you see, and therefore it's something that is incredibly difficult to track. So for heat waves, we don't have a humanitarian impact tracker, just because no one in the world is tracking the humanitarian impacts of heat waves, apart from retrospective in some countries. So in the UK and some other European countries, in the US, there's this retrospective, so that a few months after you have the data. But in most countries, not even the weather services are tracking heat waves. So it's actually really difficult to make this connection to health. India is an exception there, where there's huge awareness of that, and where you also have, and I think that's something that's really important, where you have some cities that have implemented heat health action plans, and where you've seen now that the death toll in heat waves is going down in those cities, but not in the cities where this happened. And I think this is something that we are trying to have this information and also trying to understand what are the health impacts in other parts of the world. So we have a new project with Kenya, with hospitals in Nairobi and Mombasa, and to try and make this connection more transparent, and then hopefully to use that also to be able to talk about it, so that people are aware that heat waves are killers.
Yeah. A part of that conversation for countries such as those is the loss and damages fund, and the conversations that have happened in the run-up to COP. I think more than ever before, there is a sense of frustration amongst journalists who are approaching that event. It almost seems like someone's picked it up and run with it, and it's not, in the shape and form that it was. You're a veteran of many climate trenches. What would what would be a good way to approach this journalistically, is your sense, with the kind of red letter year that we're closing up with on extreme weather events, and the fact that we have a COP that is quite vitiated in terms of the atmosphere and the mood?
Well, I think, there's this refocusing attention on the climate crisis title, although. So I think the first, or the first step to approach this is to think about, well, what's COP about? It's about, we have the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is a human rights treaty. It's not a treaty to save the polar bear. It's not an environmental treaty per se. It is a human rights treaty, which, if you read the preamble, which of course no one else does, is clearly written in there. But the way we talk about the climate crisis and the way the climate crisis in COPs are talked about is about accounting, carbon accounting, or it's about, and this is why the refocusing is necessary, because it has become, again, much more of a culture war topic than it used to be only a few years back, that it is that climate change, and particularly climate policy, is seen as something that is a luxury, that is something for some woke lefties, but that is not something that ordinary people, or that people have the time for or could afford. We don't talk about that we need these climate policies because the climate crisis is impacting the most basic human rights of people across the world, because we don't have effective climate policy. We still burn more and more fossil fuels every year. So at the current rate of burning fossil fuels, which is about 40 billion tons of CO2 a year, that means in 6 years the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees gone. So we still haven't done anything, really, nothing, but we are still nowhere near to where we need to be to take these goals serious. And of course, loss and damage has always been part, or not always, but has for a long time been part of the negotiations, but has always been ill-defined words and nothing more. And I think what we need to do is to connect who is actually, to connect these technical terms with what it actually means. Loss and damage means people dying in London, or have died in London, as well as, of course, in Kenya, in other parts of the world. But it's not something that's happening in the future or somewhere else. It's happening here and now. And I think the most important thing is that the climate policies that we need make life better for the vast majority of people, apart from those very rich who really benefit from the money made by burning and digging up fossil fuels. But that's a tiny percentage of the population. Most of us don't profit from that at all, but suffer the consequences and pay for the consequences with our health, with our lives, but also economically. Because, well, Rishi Sunak, when he decided, people had enough of climate policy, the one law he cancelled was the one that would have forced landlords to insulate homes, which would have meant, even if you include increase in rent because of the costs for the insulation, would have meant on average £300 a year less. But no one talks about that. That's nowhere in the media.
I think in that he is unique, because in the irony of ironies, even the auto companies stood out and said that that's not what we asked for. That's clearly not a well thought out idea. But perhaps we live and learn. Just one final question from me, because I'm sure the audience has many. It's also a little bit of a rock and a hard place, I think, for journalists right now, where there is a sense that when it's extreme weather event reporting, there is some fatigue amongst the audience. After a while, they say, I don't want to engage with this anymore. There's nothing I can do about it. On the other end, the ask seems to be, do more solutions journalism. but that doesn't get the kind of impact and reach that I would get when I'm talking about extreme weather. How do you navigate your way around this and fight that very real challenge that audiences are feeling tired and fatigued with the bad news?
I think that actually all the work that we've done and every extreme event that we looked at is it shows of course we always look at disasters, we always look at human suffering, humanitarian suffering, but it also always shows that are often really simple things that you could change that would mean that the next time an extreme weather event hits, things would be better. And so one of these really simple things are, for example, heat action plans. And they start really with basic things like, okay, you warn there's a heat wave. You don't illustrate the warnings with people having fun at the beach, but with actually some real consequences. And you don't tell people, oh, temperatures will be above 40 degrees, but you tell people, okay, it will be really dangerous to go out between these hours, especially if you live in inner cities where there's no green space and so on. And then you open public buildings that are air conditioned. You tell people where they are so that people can go to cool places. You provide water publicly available so that people can fill their water bottles everywhere. So a lot of things, and that saves lots of lives. And that also means it's not something you have to wait for the COP to make a decision on. That we don't have to agree globally that we can have water fountains. So that is something where there's really so much agency locally on all scales, and I think that's the stories that hopefully might help.
Yeah, we're listening. Let me open it up and go first to our first respondent, Diego.
Thanks, Freddie. It's always lovely to have you at the Institute for our sessions and for this, so thanks for making time again. I am thinking, what are fountains of the media industry? Like, what are the quicker solutions that I think we can implement in newsrooms? Because I think one thing reporters, especially not reporters, but like media executives think is like, I can cover climate change better unless I have more money to invest in my newsroom. And we don't have much money in the industry, so it's really hard. I think there's a couple of points for that. We were talking earlier with Catherine, my colleague, and the fellows today, that we don't say we don't have money to cover wars or the World Cup. Like, we always say there's money to cover stuff that needs to be covered. So some just need to be found ways to around. I think for that, an idea could be restructuring newsrooms can be one of the ways to do our water fountains. And this could be done in different ways. One of the solutions could be Political Europe has a senior climate correspondent that responds to the editor-in-chief of the news, or I think managing editor of the newsroom. So you put in someone in a newsroom in a position that can influence policy in a newsroom at a high level and respond to someone higher up. Or the Daily Maverick in South Africa, their editor of the climate section at the Daily Maverick is also the managing editor of the paper. So she has a position that she can change policy internally while also responding without having to invest, say, in more people, more funding, whatever. But also ways you can just find your local expert in your climates in your newsroom and say, can you train my team to do more climate reporting, and find more climate paragraphs in stories. If you can make more climate news in the front page, then add more climate paragraphs to each story you're doing in the newsroom. And I think trying to find the water fountains of the newsroom policy is a good way to just start changing our narrative that we can't do anything about it until we have more money in newsrooms to start changing how we cover climate change.
Thank you for that, Diego. Let me take some responses from Sanyume as well, and then maybe get Freddie's thoughts and then go back to the audience.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Freddie and Mitali. That was a very clear explanation and touches a lot on what I've been doing in education for sustainable healthcare, because healthcare is responsible for 5% of global greenhouse gas emission equivalent. And there's a lot in healthcare that needs to understand, education in healthcare needs to understand about the health impacts of climate change, which Freddie has touched on a lot just now, and also the way in which healthcare impacts on the nature and biodiversity and climate crises. And we need to educate doctors as well. And one of the things that doctors do that maybe journalists could help with is to do with doctors operating from a place of fear. There's three causes for that fear. One is fear of criticism in the media or in the press, and criticism, fear of litigation when they're trying to help patients, and then fear when they're trying to do stuff and then the regulator might come in with censure. So what happens is that a lot of medical practice is defensive, and what that means is that a lot of unnecessary things are happening. Which is not good for the patient. And so we should be looking at what matters to the patient, and that's where journalism can come in to educate the public that all this healthcare and doing everything possible because this is available isn't the way to go, and that would cut a lot of healthcare and provide healthcare for the people who need it. But overall, we need to be talking about the health impacts of climate change and how the healthcare system contributes to the crises that we're facing. So thanks very much, Freddie, for touching on a lot of the health aspects.
Thank you for that. I am conscious of time and I know there's questions, so maybe we'll do the room first and then go to the questions online. Can we start with the gentleman here and then the lady at the back?
I am Omar Zombre from Burkina Faso, West Africa. So the questions, I have many, but I will just sum up. First question, how can I convince my audience that climate change is real while Western keeps up with the consumering system and industries in China are still on, and in Africa there is kind of new rise for industrialization? How can I talk to my audience about that? And the second fact is about the COP21 Paris Agreement, finance. Where is the money? How much has been raised? Where did it go? So these are the two questions, but I have many.
I'm not sure Freddie knows where the money went, but we will try, Omar. And let me collect all the questions maybe and then bring it. The lady there, please.
Excellent question there from the gentleman from Africa. My question is simply, we have an ecocycle economic model that is driving the climate crisis. And why aren't the newspapers challenging this? I have a website called Poems for Parliament. If anyone's interested, I also have business cards with me.
The lady here and then the gentleman there.
Hi, I'm Sibel. I'm a journalist from Brazil, and I'd like to thank you for your very interesting and fascinating work. And one of the things you said about when you take a project to investigate if whether or not this weather event was caused by climate change, when you figure out it's not caused by climate change, a lot of people get upset. But I wonder to which extent it could also feel some climate change denialism speeches. I wanted to ask you how much does polarized politics influence your work? How much more pressure does it add, and how much more purpose does it add to how much more importance does it add to the important work that you're doing? Thank you.
And a question from the gentleman there. Maybe we'll pause after that and just get some answers.
Thanks very much. Hi, Fred. It's James Painter here. We've done a lot of work on media coverage of extreme weather events in different countries. And you've done these really helpful guides, as Ms. Mitali mentioned, about what journalists should and shouldn't do. Are you slightly changing now in the sense that when you're covering heat waves and there's been no event attribution studies, do you think it's now okay to say this is almost certain that this was made more likely and more intense by climate change? And secondly, do you think you should be doing more when you do say that climate change has a role to be mentioning what the essential drivers and the problem is, that is our fossil fuel usage? Because in your press releases at the moment, your media briefings, you talk a lot about vulnerabilities, and that creates problems for people, but should you be actually pinpointing what the essential problem is that we're still using so many fossil fuels? Thanks very much.
Thanks, James. That's a bunch of questions. Would you like to just run through them?
Yeah. So I think to Omar's question, that is really, I think, the most difficult question. But I think part of the reason why it's so difficult is that we all have been raised and are still believing very firmly that the status quo in the West is the best possible world we can live in, the best possible of all worlds we can live in. That a good life is living in an individual house, that is owning a car, is being ensconced with lots of concrete, and that is the epitome of freedom. Every one of us, if we think about this for a second, of course realizes that this is not true, that this is a very weird and stupid definition of freedom. But it is the one that we write about, that we use, and that is that this idea that this is the model of life that we all should aspire to is still upheld, and that is why it's so difficult. But actually, if you look at the world, if you look at the numbers, if you look at the industrialized nations, the standard of living of the larger part of the population has increased in the West between the 1930s and up to 1980. But since then, the standard of living has only increased for the very rich, but not the rest of the population. So it's not even that it's working terribly well in the countries that have become rich and wealthy by burning fossil fuels. And I think we just have to challenge this narrative that it's not the best possible world, and it's not that anyone takes something away from you if you can't burn coal, but actually that your life gets better, that the cities that we build, that we could build and should build, will be better places to live. And I think that's a real challenge to change that, and it's not just a task for the media, but for all of us. But I think that is what is the most difficult thing. To the question about when we don't find a role of climate change in an individual extreme event, and if that gives fodder for denialists. Well, I think we have gone from largely from climate change is not happening in sort of a broad part of the media to everything bad that's happening is climate change. But of course, the reality is in between. And what we are aiming to do with our work is to show what climate change means, where it's a game changer, but also where it's not, so that we have a better understanding of what it means for our daily lives. Because only then you have some agency to do something. If you think it's not happening, you don't do anything. But if you think it's an asteroid that will fall on your head next week, then you also don't do anything. And so I think, therefore, it is important to show also this where climate change does not play a role. And to be honest, it has become more difficult. These types of events are difficult, and we get then actually people within the scientific community trying, if they can frame the question differently, to maybe find a small role of climate change, which is really pointless, which is not, it's bad enough as it is. You don't have to make it worse. So it has become more difficult because it has become so much more polarized. But I think that makes it even more important to try and keep the evidence and be as transparent as we possibly can with what we do and how and why. And to James, you're absolutely right. We have not said fossil fuels enough, But if you have looked at our last press release, I'm sure you will have every time found the words fossil fuels in there and that they are the cause. Because I think that is definitely something that we have also seen, that we have talked about the consequences, but then stopped with climate change and not gone to the actual fossil fuels and the emitters. But we have made an effort to improve that. And for the guide already says that for heat waves, you don't need to wait for an attribution study. You can say climate change plays a role. I looked at it last week and said, maybe it does need updating on some things. So we are aiming to do that, yeah.
I just want to pause for a second and take some of the online questions and also say it's so great to see that there's questions from the Netherlands, Gambia, Indonesia, Bangladesh. So people all over are watching this, and that makes my heart very glad. Abir from Bangladesh is a documentary photographer covering the impact of climate change, Freddie, and he asks, he wants to wait and base his coverage on scientific evidence, but sometimes it takes really long to confirm whether the extreme rain was caused by climate change. How does he report that in a trustworthy way? Should he wait for the science or should he report?
I think he should report and should report that based on that, well, globally for heavy rainfall, we do know that it does increase. And also, I think for many parts of the world, we now also have enough studies that you can say there is a role of climate change, or there's likely no role of climate change based on that. Of course, you can't quantify it without a study, but I think for most things, you don't need to wait for a study. And even if you're unsure, then I think it's still better to report, to bring the conversation around climate change, to say how climate change does impact these types of events and harm people. Yeah, don't wait. We try to be fast, but don't wait for us.
You go on. Vera Boonman from the Netherlands, quickly before I go back to the room, says she's getting ready to cover COP28 and she wants to know, would it work to apply the findings of your organization to determine if a country should receive money from the Loss and Damage Fund? Why or why not?
That's a really tricky question. And I think definitely not in the way that I think it would be the absolute wrong suggestion to say, oh, when something happens, then you wait for an attribution study to be done, and then that determines whether you're eligible for funding. That, I think, would be absolutely wrong, because, first of all, it depends very much on the type of event and the part in the world of how good you can actually do these studies, and often it would disadvantage, again, the most vulnerable. And then, of course, also it would... well, also climate change impacts are happening in non-vulnerable countries who should not get funding from a loss and damage fund. But I think where the science is important is to inform before or when this fund is actually set up, to what kinds of events are in scope, or what kinds of losses and damages have likely or have been shown to have a climate change fingerprint, and therefore, and so that the events that are in scope are based on science. Yeah. And then also, I think it's important to use this kind of science to estimate how big the fund actually needs to be, because at the moment, I think they're pledged 230 million, which is ridiculously little sum. So that is absolutely nowhere near of what in most cases even a single extreme event costs. And I think I think that is also where the science is important. But that's sort of to set up the fund, not for the payouts. I think that should be based on if the event is in scope, and if you are a developing country, you should get money.
I remember conversations with journalist friends from Pakistan last year when the floods hit, and there was sort of aid that begun to be given to the country, where many of them shrugged and said, we can't remember in recent memory a year where we didn't have devastating floods. I wonder what it takes to get to a tipping point where people say, okay, now you need some money and support. Now it looks like you really are struggling and suffering. There was a lady at the back, I think, who had her hand up for a question. Maybe Hongxiao here, the gentleman there.
Hi, this is Hongxia Liu, journalist fellow at the Reuters Institute. I've also been covering climate change since the last decade, and I've repeatedly heard frustrations from scientists saying, the science is so clear, but still there is a lot of inaction. And I guess here, when we talk about refocusing attention on the climate crisis, I wonder what additional responsibility actions, inspiration initiatives that scientists can take to move the conversation forward. And what would you do if you have that additional capacity? Thanks.
Shall we quickly collect the other questions because I know we're short on time. The gentleman there.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Marcel Seger. I'm a default student here at the School of Geography in the Environment. My research group looks at pathways achieving the preset goals, particularly from a demand side perspective. And based on a Nature Communications paper released in 2018, there's tons of those out there, but there's a clear evidence that we can achieve the low carbon transition even purely based on demand side adjustments. So my question relating back to the journalist angle is, instead of, or in addition to highlighting studies which look, let me phrase it, in the rear mirror, where do you see the potential or even the implication, the responsibility of journalists to look ahead and inform society to what it needs to embark on those pathways? And let's face it, we even have the technology available, not only hardware facing, but also software facing, where we can bring demand and supply together more adequately through digital technology, for instance. I see strong potential to inform society. So I'd be interested in your perspective towards informing about climate weather extremes, but also looking ahead, what needs to happen.
Shall we take one final question and then someone is reaching you with a mic.
Hi, I'm Amanda Power, History. As some of you will know, I've been raising the question of how humanities and social sciences people can be a bit more present in these discussions. And I think one of the things that's very striking, and I think we've probably all noticed about how the media reports these things, it's very formulaic. There's always, it's really bad, but in the last paragraph, we have grounds for hope if we do this thing quickly. And you read these articles and they're always much the same. And I think if you read articles about disastrous situations, there is a lot of focus on the most vulnerable people in those kinds of articles. They've lost everything. But what there isn't in those articles is the rich person who's gone off and just built another house. And it's a shift in the story, even if those articles covered both those things, so that you could see that it's coming out differently for different people. At the moment, there are victims that many wealthy people or many comfortable people don't empathize with. There isn't enough coverage of the people in the middle. But I suppose what I'm interested in is what Freddie might say about bringing in a kind of a wider disciplinary involvement in these conversations, not as people helping to communicate the science, but people helping to develop the stories so that they become a little less familiar, a little less well-trodden, and make those kind of points that in a kind of capitalist-facing media ecosystem, it's kind of hard to make directly, but that you can make indirectly by telling slightly different stories. Thank you.
I will say though, there are many types of articles and many types of journalists and many journalists across the world. Perhaps what all of us could benefit from is sort of widening the scope of the stories that we read from communities that have sometimes very different stories to tell than the ones that you narrated as sort of by copybook that you've come across. But Freddie, would you like to take those?
I think actually, if I had more, what I think the scientific community is on the one hand frustrated that nothing happens, but on the other hand, most of my colleagues are absolutely refuse to ever speak to a journalist, unless the journalist asks a question about a specific paper they have just published, and I think unless we change that. Then scientists really don't have that much right to be frustrated, because I think it's, in my mind, it's part of our job, especially if you get sort of public funding to do your research, to also interpret your research and to talk about it. But I think, so one thing that, and I'm even struggling with my own team to get them talk about anything but the study they've just done. So because there are lots of journalists who have questions about, oh, there's this politician has said X, what does the science say? And I think it's really important that we enable also scientists to speak to that. And of course you can't speak to everything, and that's also important to say, I don't know this, but to have a bit more broader horizon. And yeah, so maybe we can also do the opposite, that you train us, or that we have scientists who get more training, and not just the one media training run by the comms officer, but really to have maybe a cohort of scientists who become spokespeople to journalists. So I think there is definitely a huge amount that needs to be done also from that side.
And just quickly, Freddie, it's not a pitch to our research again, but for the 8 countries that we surveyed, right on top in terms of trust is climate scientists. That's where the audience places the most trust on, and right at the bottom is politicians. Don't know why we got there, but we got there. Please, these are the people that we want to listen to, that the audience wants to listen to. So absolutely.
So to your question, I think, when I tried to say with respect to agency earlier, I think that is really important, that you don't only show the disaster and the extreme event, but then also the agency you have to change things. And I think, especially on the demand side, there's a lot that you can do. But I think there's also when we talk about mitigation, most when we are sort of in the media and the public, politicians, then it's usually some dreams about future technologies and CCS, and I think journalists really need to also challenge that and say, the science is very clear, this is ridiculously expensive, it will never be available at the scales we need it, but we have the knowledge and we have the tools to actually do all the other things, like reducing the demand, other kinds of renewable energies and so on. And I think that's something that, when there are budgets for green or budgets, and most of the budget goes to research and development for CCS, and at best, even for some businesses, then this is just a joke. It's not what is consistent with the evidence, is not what we need. And I think that needs to be challenged a lot more as well. And I think to your point, I think we need a lot more different stories. And you're right, the stories are always very formulaic. Well, I guess the stories that I tell are also always the same. So I think we do need historians, we do need novels, we do need more art, we do need lots of other sectors who really change this narrative that the best world we live in is the status quo, and that every change you could possibly ask for is terrible. So I think we really need all sides of society to challenge and change that.
As you are. Ladies and gentlemen, a very, very warm round of applause, please, for Freddie. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here. So these are symposiums that we conduct every term, of course, at Reuters. The one special one is held in person. We will be back online next week, and you can read the details on our website. For now, I want to give a big thank you to the Reuters team for putting all this together. Thank you to the Green Templeton team as well for supporting us and collaborating on such a great conversation. Thank you all for being here.